The alien ship appeared without warning at the edge of human space, and it was massive beyond anything Commander Jacob Pierce had ever seen in his 20 years of military service. He stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiance watching the obsidian vessel materialize from faster-than-light travel, and felt his stomach tighten with dread. The ship dwarfed his heavy cruiser by a factor of 10, and its hull gleamed with an otherworldly darkness that seemed to absorb the light of distant stars. Weapon ports lined its flanks like teeth in the mouth of some ancient predator, and Jacob knew immediately that humanity was facing something far beyond their current capabilities. Lieutenant Kate Morrison turned from her communications console, and her voice was steady despite the tension that filled every corner of the bridge. She reported that the alien vessel was hailing them, and Jacob ordered her to put the transmission through. The view screen flickered to life, revealing a creature with 4 eyes and angular features that studied Jacob with what might have been contempt or amusement. The alien introduced himself as High Commander Vethrak of the Keltheran Imperial Fleet, and his words were translated into flat, emotionless English by the ship's computer systems. Vethrak delivered his message with the casual certainty of someone who had done this countless times before, and the words sent ice through Jacob's veins. The Keltheran Empire had evaluated humanity and found them suitable for subjugation. All military assets were to be surrendered immediately, and all defensive installations dismantled without delay. Humanity would submit to imperial authority or face complete annihilation. The deadline was 72 hours, and the response was to be delivered to the Imperial Council at Kelthera Prime. Vethrak spoke as if human. Extinction was a foregone conclusion, and resistance merely a minor inconvenience that would be dealt with in due course. Jacob felt every eye on the bridge turn toward him, and in the silence that followed he could hear the quiet hum of the ship's reactor and the soft beep of sensor arrays. These were men and women who had trained their entire lives for combat, but had never expected to face the end of everything they knew. Jacob looked at the alien commander and spoke slowly and deliberately. He told Vethrak that humanity does not kneel to anyone and never would. The Keltheran's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile, and he replied that humanity had chosen ashes over submission. The transmission ended abruptly, and the massive dreadnought vanished into faster-than-light space, leaving the Defiance alone in the dark. Jacob immediately ordered his communications officer to send an emergency transmission to Fleet Command on Earth, and then began plotting a course back to the home system. He knew the message he carried would throw humanity into chaos, but there was no choice. The Keltheran were coming, and humanity had less than 3 days to prepare for war or surrender. As the Defiance jumped into faster-than-light travel, Jacob stood at the viewport and wondered if he had just sealed the fate of his entire species by refusing to kneel. On Earth, the emergency session of the United Nations Security Council convened within hours of receiving Jacob's report, and the chamber filled with heated arguments and desperate proposals. Some delegates called for immediate surrender, while others demanded military preparation, and Admiral Richard Hayes stood before the assembly listening to the chaos with growing frustration. He was a career military officer who had spent 40 years in uniform, and he had never expected to face a threat like this. The Keltheran Empire was unknown to human records, but their technology and confidence spoke of a civilization far older and more powerful than humanity's barely 2 centuries of space travel. Richard finally slammed his hand on the podium, and the room fell silent. He spoke with controlled anger about surrender and what it would mean for humanity's future. The Keltheran viewed humans as primitives, and they had threatened every man, woman, and child on Earth and the colonies. Richard asked if the assembled leaders truly believed surrender would save anyone, or merely delay the inevitable extinction of human independence. A diplomat from the European coalition stood and argued for realism, pointing out that humanity's fleet numbered less than 300 ships against an empire that had conquered hundreds of worlds. The vote was called, and the result was closer than it should have been, but in the end humanity chose to fight. In the shipyards above Mars, workers scrambled to accelerate production schedules, and every available vessel was pulled from civilian service and retrofitted for combat. The colonies sent their militia fleets toward Earth in response to the emergency call, and messages went out across all human worlds to prepare for invasion. The 72 hours passed in a blur of preparation and mounting dread as humanity assembled the largest military force it had ever created. 347 warships from Massive carriers to nimble destroyers hung in formation around Earth. When the deadline arrived, Richard stood in the command center of the orbital defense station Genesis, looking out at the assembled fleet and knowing it would not be enough. The Keltheran response arrived precisely on schedule, when 5,000 ships emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system. Their formation stretched across space like a wall of death, and at their center flew the Imperial banner that had flown over the ruins of countless civilizations. Richard gave the order for all ships to move to battle stations and told his forces that today they would show the galaxy what humanity was made of. The first battle of Earth lasted 18 hours, and human ships fought with a ferocity that surprised the Keltheran commanders. Every vessel that fell took enemies with it, and every captain who knew their ship was doomed rammed it into the nearest enemy dreadnought. The defense stations orbiting Earth poured fire into the alien fleet with mechanical precision, but it was not enough. By the time the Keltheran withdrew to regroup, humanity had lost 112 ships while the enemy had lost barely 30. Richard stood among the wreckage of the command center with his uniform torn and bloodied from an explosion that had killed 3 of his staff officers. A young officer named Lucas Grant approached with a message from Vethrak, demanding immediate surrender and threatening to target Earth's cities in the next attack. Richard looked at the tactical display and thought of his daughter and grandchildren and the billions of souls counting on him. He told Lucas to send Vethrak a simple response to go to hell. The second wave hit Earth's orbital defenses with overwhelming force, and High Commander Vethrak had no patience left for human resistance. The defense stations died first as concentrated bombardment reduced them to scrap metal, and Genesis lasted 47 minutes before its reactor went critical. The explosion lit up the night sky over Asia like a second sun, and 5 other stations fell within the hour. Lieutenant Sophie Blake watched from her post at Toronto Defense. Command as streaks of fire rained down through the atmosphere, and she knew the ground invasion would come next. But the Keltheran had no intention of landing troops because they had a more efficient method of breaking human spirit. The first kinetic strike hit the Pacific Ocean west of California, and a tungsten rod dropped from orbit struck the water at 7,000 meters per second. The impact released energy equivalent to a nuclear weapon, and a massive tsunami raced toward the coast. Evacuation sirens wailed across San Francisco as people ran through the streets in panic while the wall of water approached. Sophie watched the satellite feeds in horror as the wave hit at 3:47 in the afternoon and swept away everything in its path. By the time the water receded, San Francisco was gone, and 40 million people were dead. The second strike hit Mumbai, and the third hit Tokyo, and the fourth hit London, while Vethrak's message arrived 30 minutes later. Submit, or we will erase every city on your world, and you have 6 hours to decide. In the ruins of the Geneva Command bunker, Admiral Richard Hayes stared at casualty reports that showed the destruction of entire metropolitan areas. Some members of the Security Council were calling for surrender, arguing that humanity could not protect civilians against this kind of assault. Richard opened his mouth to give the order that would end human independence when the communication console lit up with an emergency signal from Titan Research. Station. Dr. Patricia Webb appeared on screen, looking exhausted with gray hair disheveled and eyes red from lack of sleep. She spoke without preamble and asked Richard if he could buy her 72 hours. Richard started to protest, but Patricia interrupted and told him she had invented a miracle weapon. For 5 years, her team had been working on experimental propulsion and weapon systems that the military deemed too expensive and too theoretical. 3 days ago, they had achieved a breakthrough that would change everything. The Keltheran had better weapons and shields and more ships, but they used technology thousands of years old.
Humanity could not beat them by playing their game, so
Patricia's team was changing the rules entirely. She pulled up technical diagrams showing a ship design called the Reaper and explained that 3 prototypes had been built in the construction bays on Titan. They were smaller than current warships with crews of only 15 each, but they were equipped with weapons that operated on principles the Keltheran had never encountered. Quantum disruption torpedoes could phase through shields, and graviton beam projectors could crush capital ships like tin cans. The propulsion system did not just move through space, but manipulated space itself. Richard asked why humanity had not heard about this technology before, and Patricia admitted that every test had failed catastrophically until the invasion gave them motivation to take dangerous risks. Richard looked at Earth, surrounded by Keltheran warships, and pointed out that 3 ships against 5,000 was suicide. Patricia interrupted again and said it would not be 3 ships for long. She was sending specifications that would allow manufacturing facilities in the belt to start immediate production. Humanity could have 30 to 40 Reapers operational within a month, and 300 within 3 months. Patricia told Richard they could not save Earth today, but they could save humanity. They could build a fleet that would make the Keltheran regret ever hearing about humans. Richard felt a spark of hope, for the first time since the invasion began, and told Patricia he would hold the Keltheran off for 72 hours. Richard initiated Operation Exodus, and every available transport began ferrying evacuees from Earth to the belt colonies and outer system stations. The Keltheran allowed the transports to depart because Vethrak believed humanity was finally broken and scattered refugees would be easier to rule than a defended homeworld. Sophie Blake was on one of the last transports to leave Earth, and as her ship climbed toward orbit, she looked back at the blue marble spinning peacefully below. She could see smoke plumes from burning cities and debris fields from destroyed stations and the scars of Keltheran bombardment. She whispered that humanity would be back and swore it on everything she held dear. On Titan, Patricia Webb and her team worked without rest for 72 hours straight. Engineers welded hull plates while physicists calibrated exotic weapon systems and pilots trained on simulators that crashed more often than they functioned properly. The third Reaper prototype finally came online with 8 hours to spare after a terrifying power spike that nearly destroyed the entire facility. When Richard arrived on Titan aboard the refugee carrier Horizon, Patricia met him at the docking bay looking like she had not slept in a week. She took him to the construction bay, and Richard stepped through the airlock and stopped breathing at the sight before him. The 3 Reaper-class ships hung suspended in zero gravity like sharks waiting to hunt, and they were smaller than Richard expected. Their hulls were matte black, absorbing all light and bearing no markings or insignia. These ships belonged to no nation but to humanity's fury itself. Richard said they were beautiful, but Patricia corrected him and said they were weapons about to introduce the Keltheran to concepts like pain and fear. The pilots were volunteers who understood the risks, and each had survived the first battle of Earth while losing family to the bombardment. Richard briefed them on their mission, which was to hit the Keltheran fleet in orbit of Earth and hurt them badly enough to show that humanity was not beaten. The 3 Reapers launched from Titan and activated their experimental drives while space twisted around them as they accelerated to impossible speeds. The journey from Saturn to Earth took 6 hours instead of weeks, and High Commander Vethrak was reviewing occupation plans when his sensors detected 3 small vessels approaching at velocities that should not exist. Before he could order defensive action, the Reapers opened fire. Quantum disruption torpedoes passed through shields as if they did not exist, and materialized inside Keltheran hulls before detonating. A massive dreadnought simply ceased to exist in an instant, while graviton beams created localized gravity wells that crushed cruisers like aluminum cans. In 15 minutes, the 3 Reapers destroyed 18 Keltheran capital ships and then vanished back into faster-than-light space before the enemy fleet could organize a response. Vethrak stood on his bridge staring at casualty reports in disbelief, because 18 ships destroyed by 3 tiny human vessels was impossible and humiliating and terrifying. For the first time in 3,000 years of conquest, the Keltheran Empire felt something it had never experienced before, which was doubt. And in the outer system and hidden shipyards across the belt, production lines roared to life as the age of the Reaper began, and humanity prepared to show the galaxy what happened when you tried to make them kneel. 6 months after the first Reaper strike, the Keltheran Empire held Earth in an iron grip with occupation forces deployed to every major continent. High Commander Vethrak had established military outposts in every surviving city and instituted martial law with brutal efficiency. The humans who remained on the surface lived under constant surveillance, with every movement monitored by Keltheran drones. But in the asteroid belt, and the moons of Jupiter and Saturn and the ice fields of the Kuiper belt, humanity was building something the galaxy had never seen before. Admiral Richard Hayes stood in the observation deck of Forge Station, watching construction bays stretch out before him like a metal forest. In each bay, a Reaper-class warship took shape, and the first production run had yielded 42 operational vessels. The second run had doubled that number, And now, with manufacturing refinements and 3 more stations online, humanity was producing nearly 30 Reapers per week. Captain Kevin Ross pointed out that intelligence reports showed the Keltheran had committed another 2,000 ships to the occupation force. Even with 200 Reapers, humanity was still outnumbered 10 to 1, but Richard had no intention of fighting them head-on. Richard pulled up a holographic star map, highlighting Keltheran supply routes throughout human space. Red lines crisscrossed the map like veins, and each one represented convoy routes that kept the occupation forces supplied. The Keltheran Empire was vast and had conquered hundreds of worlds across light years of space. That kind of empire needed logistics and supply chains, and vulnerable supply chains that humanity intended to cut. Richard told his officers they were going to make the Keltheran bleed and teach them that occupying human space came at a terrible price. Lieutenant Sophie Blake had been transferred to the Reaper program after her evacuation from Earth, and her experience in ground defense tactics made her valuable for planning strike operations. She stood in a briefing room addressing the assembled captains of the newly commissioned Black Fleet. That was what people called them now because 212 Reaper-class ships with crews dressed in black uniforms without rank insignia were ghosts that struck without warning and vanished before retaliation could come. The Keltheran had put a bounty on any Black Fleet ship destroyed, but so far they had only managed to damage 3 and destroy 1. Sophie explained that their target was the Altris Supply Depot, which was a massive orbital facility in the Centauri system. Intelligence indicated this depot serviced the entire occupation force in the home system. Food and ammunition and replacement, parts and reinforcements all flowed through Altris. Destroying this depot would strand 20,000 Keltheran soldiers on Earth without resupply. Commander Elizabeth Barnes raised her hand and pointed out that the facility would be heavily defended. The Black Fleet had hit smaller targets, but this was an order of magnitude larger, and the enemy would be expecting them. Sophie agreed they would be expecting a raid of 3 or 4 ships hitting fast and vanishing. They would not be expecting 70 Reaper-class ships in a coordinated assault on all defensive positions. The operational plan called for overwhelming the enemy's response capability and destroying the depot in 18 minutes from first shot to withdrawal. The briefing room buzzed with excited conversation because this would be the largest Black Fleet operation to date. Sophie added that Dr. Webb's team had developed upgraded quantum torpedoes called Nova warheads, and one torpedo could take out a station the size of Altoris. Richard Hayes stepped into the briefing room and explained that while the main force hit the depot strike, teams would be hitting 17 other supply points across the sector simultaneously. By the time the sun rose tomorrow, the Keltheran occupation force would be cut off and isolated and vulnerable. The operation launched 36 hours later, when 70 Reaper-class ships departed Forge Station in complete communication silence. They split into multiple groups, taking different routes to their rendezvous points. Sophie commanded the UNS. Shadow and her hands were steady on the controls, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, monitored sensor feeds as they approached Altoris. The enemy depot came into visual range with a defensive fleet of 42 escorts and 12 heavy cruisers. Point defense grids were active, and the Keltheran defenders scrambled to respond when the Reapers dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. The Black Fleet surrounded the depot like a closing fist, and Sophie transmitted on the encrypted channel for all ships to open fire. Elizabeth Barnes led Squadron 1 against the escort screen, with ships flickering in and out of normal space as they fired graviton beams. Keltheran escorts exploded or were crushed into twisted metal sculptures, while Squadron 2 engaged the heavy cruisers with quantum torpedoes. Sophie took the Shadow straight toward the depot itself, dodging return fire with maneuvering that would have torn apart a conventional ship. Jake reported target lock achieved and Nova warhead armed and ready. Sophie commanded fire, and the Nova torpedo launched from the forward tube. It was smaller than standard quantum torpedoes but contained enough exotic matter to rewrite local reality. The warhead phased through the depot's incomplete shields and detonated at the coordinates of the central reactor core. The explosion was visible from Earth as space itself seemed to fold inward. The depot collapsed into a temporary singularity that lasted 3 seconds before evaporating, and when the light cleared, Altoris was gone along with 5,000 Keltheran personnel and billions of tons of supplies. Sophie shouted that the target was destroyed and ordered all units to withdraw. A cheer went up across the human fleet even as the battle continued around them. Across the sector, 17 other supply points experienced similar attacks, and by the time the Keltheran High Command realized the scope of the offensive, they had lost 40% of their logistics infrastructure. On Earth, the occupation troops received emergency rationing orders and patrols were reduced. Military operations were suspended while commanders figured out how to function without regular supplies from home. And in the cities and ruins and refugee camps, humans who had lived under Keltheran rule for 6 months began to whisper about the Black Fleet. High Commander Vethrak convened an emergency meeting of his senior officers, and the holographic display showed the tactical situation in brutal clarity. Supply lines were cut, and reinforcements delayed, and occupation forces stretched thin across too many worlds. Vethrak demanded to know how many ships the Black Fleet had, and his chief strategist reported intelligence estimates of between 200 and 300 vessels. Their technology gave them effectiveness far beyond their numbers, and a single Reaper could engage targets that would require a squadron of Keltheran cruisers. Vethrak ordered every available ship to search for the construction facilities where humans built these vessels. If they could cut off production, they could win through attrition. Another officer hesitantly suggested negotiation and offering humans client state status within the Empire with autonomy in exchange for peace. Vethrak slammed his hand on the table with enough force to crack the surface. The Keltheran Empire does not negotiate with primitives and does not show weakness. He sent word to the Imperial fleet at Kelthera Prime requesting 5,000 more ships and invasion troops and authorization to use orbital bombardment on any human settlement harboring Black Fleet personnel. But in the depths of space and hidden facilities scattered across the outer system, humanity's response was already underway. Richard Hayes had anticipated the Keltheran escalation and planned for it. New vessels took shape in the shipyards, and these were not just Reapers anymore, but larger capital ships built around the same exotic technology. Humans called them Executioner-class dreadnoughts, and in training facilities a new generation of pilots prepared for war. They were children who had watched their world burn, and teenagers who had lost everything, and young adults who wanted nothing more than to make the invaders pay. The Keltheran reinforcement fleet arrived in human space 8 months after the initial invasion, with 5,000 warships and troop transports carrying 2 million soldiers. All forces were under the command of Grand Admiral Kelthus, who was a veteran of 30 successful campaigns and architect of the siege of the Draven worlds. Kelthus was not like Vethrak because where the High Commander was impulsive and prone to displays of dominance, Kelthus was methodical and calculating and utterly ruthless. He had earned his reputation by breaking species that had resisted for decades and believed humanity would fall within a year. His first action was to order a complete census of the surviving human population on Earth. Every man, woman, and child was to be registered and tagged, with tracking implants and assigned to labor details. Resistance would be met with collective punishment, and for every Keltheran soldier killed 100 humans would be executed. The decree went out across all occupied territories, and in the city formerly known as New York, a Keltheran patrol enforced the new registration requirements. A young man named Gregory Walsh, who had been a medical student before the invasion, watched a Keltheran officer strike an elderly woman who could not walk fast enough. Something inside Gregory snapped after 6 months of occupation and humiliation and watching his world die. He threw a rock at the Keltheran officer, and the rock bounced harmlessly off the alien's armor. The officer turned and raised his weapon, and Gregory stood frozen, realizing too late what he had done. The officer fired, and Gregory fell with a smoking hole in his chest. The crowd screamed and scattered while more Keltheran troops arrived. Following Kelthus's orders precisely, they began selecting people at random for execution, but something strange happened before they could begin. The air filled with a high-pitched whine, and reality seemed to shimmer. A single Reaper-class ship materialized in the middle of the street, barely 10 meters off the ground. The UNS Retribution hovered with its weapons ports opening like the eyes of an ancient god. Lieutenant Commander Sam Fisher spoke over the ship's external speakers with his voice amplified to reach every human in the zone. He told the Keltheran occupation forces they had 10 seconds to release the civilians or face immediate destruction. The Keltheran troops scrambled for cover, but they were infantry, not equipped to fight a warship. Some raised weapons in futile defiance while others tried to use humans as shields. Sam did not wait for the countdown to finish. The Retribution's point defense lasers swept through Keltheran positions with surgical precision. Enemy soldiers fell and their armor offered no protection against weapons designed to shoot down missiles. In under a minute, the entire patrol was dead and the Retribution landed fully in the street. Crew members in black uniforms rushed out distributing weapons and supplies to stunned civilians. Sam announced that anyone who wanted to fight should come with them, and anyone who wanted to survive should hide the supplies and wait for the signal. The Black Fleet was coming for Earth, and when they did, they would need help. Humanity does not kneel, not now and not ever. The Retribution lifted off and vanished into the sky before Keltheran reinforcements could arrive. Similar raids occurred in 47 cities across Earth over the next week, and the Black Fleet was evolving from a purely military force into something that terrified the Keltheran High Command, which was an insurgency with advanced technology. Grand Admiral Kalthus reviewed the reports and made a decision. If humans wanted to play at guerrilla warfare, he would respond with overwhelming force. He ordered the construction of a weapon that would break human resistance once and for all, which was a planetary pacification array capable of sterilizing entire continents with radiation pulses. The construction site was in orbit of Earth's moon, protected by 200 warships and defensive platforms that could detect anything larger than a fighter at 10 million kilometers range. It was the most heavily defended position in human space, which is exactly why Admiral Richard Hayes chose it as the target for Operation Titan's Hammer on Forge Station. Richard briefed his fleet commanders on the most ambitious operation in human military history. The holographic display showed the moon and the construction site and the massive Keltharan defensive fleet surrounding it. Richard explained that the weapon could not be allowed to become operational because intelligence estimated completion in 6 weeks. At that point, the Keltharan could kill every human on Earth without landing another soldier. They had to destroy it now, even though they faced 300 Reapers and 20 Executioner dreadnoughts against twice their number of enemy capital ships all dug into defensive positions. Commander Elizabeth Barnes pointed out this was not a raid but a fleet engagement that would result in heavy casualties. Richard acknowledged the cost but said if they did not stop this weapon, there would be no one left to care about casualties. This was the moment where humanity either saved itself or watched itself die. Captain Sophie Blake, who now commanded the Executioner-class ship UNS Vengeance, asked about retaliation against Earth's population. Richard revealed a second phase of the operation where special operations teams would hit every Keltharan command post on Earth simultaneously. They would decapitate the occupation structure so fast, the enemy would not have time to issue retaliation orders. The room fell silent as commanders absorbed the scope of what they were being asked to do. This was not hit and run, but total commitment of everything humanity had built over 8 months, thrown into a single decisive battle. Elizabeth asked when they would launch, and Richard said tomorrow. The Black Fleet assembled in the shadow of Saturn's rings with 320 vessels, representing humanity's last hope. Sophie stood on the bridge of the Vengeance, looking at the tactical display and thinking about Earth, waiting somewhere beyond sensor range. If they failed today, it would become a tomb. The Black Fleet entered faster than light space and vanished from Saturn orbit. On Earth's moon, Keltharan sensor technicians detected the mass transit event and immediately raised the alarm. 200 warships powered up weapons and shields, expecting another raid that would be easily repulsed. They were not prepared for what emerged when the Black Fleet dropped out of faster than light space in perfect formation, with every ship arriving simultaneously in pre-planned positions. Before the Keltharan could finish processing sensor data, the Executioners opened fire. Sophie's Vengeance targeted the command dreadnought at the center of the enemy formation. Her ship's main weapon was a scaled-up graviton beam, powerful enough to crush capital ships. The beam lanced across space and the Keltharan flagship's shields collapsed under assault. A second blast tore through its hull and the massive vessel broke in half. Richard transmitted from his command ship for all Reapers to open fire and make every shot count. 300 Reaper-class ships swarmed through the Keltharan formation like sharks in a feeding frenzy. Quantum torpedoes materialized inside enemy hulls while graviton beams created gravitational anomalies that tore ships apart. The Keltharan defensive fleet designed to repel raids and bombardments found itself in a knife fight with an enemy that could appear anywhere, and strike without warning, and vanish before retaliation could come. But the Keltheran were not helpless, and their numerical advantage still mattered. Energy beams lanced out from battleships, catching Reapers in crossfires. The UNS Swift took a direct hit and exploded, with its crew of 15 dying instantly, while the UNS Phantom lost drive systems and drifted helpless before a Keltheran cruiser finished it with missiles. Human ships died, but for every Reaper destroyed, 3 Keltheran vessels burned. Sophie maneuvered the Vengeance through chaos, with her crew firing with mechanical precision. She ordered targeting of the construction site itself, which was the incomplete planetary pacification array hanging in space like a skeletal hand. Keltheran construction crews scrambled to evacuate while Sophie targeted the central reactor core. 8 Nova warheads launched from the Vengeance, and each one carried enough exotic matter to rewrite reality in a localized area. They phased through incomplete shields and detonated simultaneously. The explosion was visible from Earth as the construction site collapsed into a temporary singularity and vanished. Thousands of Keltheran workers died without knowing what killed them. Sophie shouted that the target was destroyed and the weapon was gone. A cheer went up across the human fleet even as battle continued around them. On-Earth Special Forces teams struck and hit Keltheran command posts across the planet. In New York and Beijing and what remained of London, human soldiers with advanced weapons stormed enemy positions. Sam Fisher led a team into the primary occupation headquarters and found Grand Admiral Kelthus reviewing tactical displays of the space battle. Kelthus looked up as Sam entered and said calmly that the human fleet was losing. They may have destroyed the weapon, but were still outnumbered, and in another hour their ships would be debris. Sam admitted maybe, but said that weapon would have killed everyone on the planet. They stopped it, and that was all that mattered. Kelthus asked if Sam thought this changed anything, because the Empire had thousands of worlds and millions of ships. Even if humans won today, tomorrow the Empire would return with 10 times their numbers. Sam smiled grimly and said then humanity would delay it again, and the battle in lunar orbit raged for 6 hours, and when it finally ended, half the Black Fleet was gone. 160 ships were destroyed with thousands of crew members dead, but the Keltheran had lost more. Of the 200 warships that defended the construction site, only 43 survived, and the rest were debris fields orbiting the moon. Admiral Richard Hayes stood on the bridge of his command ship looking at casualty reports, and the price had been terrible. So many good people and brave souls gone forever, but they had won. The weapon was destroyed and the occupation command was shattered, and for the first time since the invasion began, humanity had proven it, could stand against the full might of the Keltharian Empire and survive. Captain Kevin Ross reported quietly that a message had come from the remaining Keltheran forces requesting terms of surrender. Richard looked at the tactical display showing scattered remnants of the enemy fleet. He told Kevin to inform them they must withdraw from human space immediately, and any ship remaining in human territory in 6 hours would be destroyed. He added to send a message to the Keltheran Empire that humanity was done kneeling, and from now on they would deal with humans as equals or not at all. The Keltheran withdrawal from Earth took 3 days, and surviving occupation forces, now leaderless and demoralized, boarded transports under watchful guns of the Black Fleet. Human soldiers, who had hidden weapons and waited for their moment, now stood guard, ensuring the aliens who had terrorized them left without causing further harm. In the ruins of San Francisco, rebuilt partially since the tsunami, civilians gathered to watch the last Keltheran transport lift into the sky. When it vanished into the clouds, a cheer rose from the crowd that could be heard for kilometers. Gregory Walsh, who had survived his shooting thanks to quick medical intervention from the Black Fleet raid, stood with the crowd. The tracking implant the Keltheran had forced on him lay in pieces at his feet, crushed under his boot. He looked up at the sky and whispered a prayer for the pilots who had saved him, and for the fleet that had freed his world. But Richard Hayes knew that Earth's liberation was only the beginning, because the Keltheran still controlled human colonies in 12 other star systems. Thousands of people were still living under occupation, and humanity could not abandon them. In the command center of Forge, station now operating openly, Richard convened his senior officers for strategic assessment. Captain Sophie Blake, her face bearing scars from the lunar battle, nodded in agreement when Richard said the colonies had sent militia fleets to help defend Earth at the war's start. Most of those ships were destroyed in the first battle, and humanity owed them support. Dr. Patricia Webb joined the meeting via holographic link and added that intelligence indicated the Keltheran were regrouping. They had pulled back to fortified positions around colonies they still held, and were building up for another invasion with everything they had. Commander Elizabeth. Barnes pulled up tactical displays showing Keltheran fleet movements throughout the sector. Reconnaissance showed they were assembling a force of at least 10,000 ships, and if they managed to concentrate that many vessels in one place, they could overwhelm humanity through pure numbers despite technology advantages. Richard said then they would not let the enemy concentrate. They would hit them now while scattered and reorganizing. They would liberate colonies one by one and keep the Keltheran off balance, reacting instead of planning. They would show every species in the galaxy that the Keltheran Empire was not invincible. The room fell silent as implications sank in, because what Richard proposed was not defensive strategy, but offensive war. Humanity would take the fight to an empire that had ruled unchallenged for millennia. Lieutenant Commander Sam Fisher, recently promoted after his ground operations on Earth, spoke up. He pointed out that if humanity did this, there was no going back. Right now, the Keltheran might still accept negotiated peace and offer to leave humans alone in exchange for concessions. But if humanity invaded their territory and started destroying their fleets and liberating conquered worlds, they would never stop coming after humans. Richard looked around the room at faces of men and women who had given everything to save humanity. They were tired and scarred, and many carried weight of lost friends and family, but in their eyes he saw determination that burned hotter than any star. Richard said quietly that the Keltheran came to human homes and demanded they kneel. They destroyed cities and killed millions and tried to break human spirit, but they failed. Now they wanted to negotiate, but the answer was no. Now humanity would show them the price of their aggression. And what happened when you tried to enslave humans? He activated the holographic display highlighting the nearest occupied colony, which was New Shanghai in the Tau Ceti system. The Keltheran garrison consisted of 300 ships and ground forces holding 2 million colonists hostage. Humanity was going in with the full Black Fleet to free those people and send a message echoing across every corner of Keltheran space that humanity fights back. The liberation of New Shanghai began 2 weeks later, when the Black Fleet, now numbering 400 ships, arrived in Tau Ceti in coordinated mass transit. The Keltheran garrison, expecting months to prepare, found itself facing an armada, refined through brutal combat experience. Sophie commanded the assault, from the Vengeance now repaired and upgraded, with additional weapon systems. Her squadron of Executioner-class ships engaged the defensive fleet, while Reapers swept through to strike garrison facilities. The battle was swift and decisive, because the Keltheran, still following doctrine designed for conventional fleets, could not adapt fast enough to reality-warping technology. Quantum torpedoes materialized inside command ships, and graviton beams crushed defensive platforms. When the garrison tried to threaten civilians, they found Sam Fisher's special forces had already infiltrated the surface and neutralized occupation. Commanders New Shanghai fell in 8 hours, and colonists who had suffered under Keltheran rule for nearly a year emerged from barracks and shelters to see human ships overhead. Many wept openly, while others grabbed weapons and joined militia forces being organized to defend their freed world. Richard said 1 down and 11 to go. The colony liberations continued over following months as Arcturus Station and New Boston and mining colonies of Wolf 359 fell as the Black Fleet swept through human space like a tide of retribution. The Keltheran tried to concentrate forces and create strong points that could resist, but Richard's strategy of rapid strikes kept them scattered and reactive. At the Battle of Henderson's World, the Keltheran made their stand with 2,000 ships determined to stop the Black Fleet's advance. The engagement lasted 3 days and resulted in the largest space battle in human history. When it ended, the Keltheran fleet was shattered and Henderson's World was free, but victory came at terrible cost. 93 human ships were destroyed, including 5 executioners, and Elizabeth Barnes died when her ship, the UNS Righteous, took a direct hit from a Keltheran dreadnought's main cannon. Her last transmission was simple, which was keep fighting and make them pay. Richard attended the memorial service in the observation deck of Forge Station, looking out at stars that held so much blood and sacrifice. He thought about all the people who had died since this war began and the price humanity had paid for freedom. Patricia Webb asked if it was worth it, because all these deaths and destruction had transformed humanity into something darker. Richard said yes without hesitation because the alternative was slavery and extinction. The Keltheran wanted to make humans into subjects and another conquered race in their empire. Humanity had shown them that humans would never accept chains, and whatever they had become was better than kneeling. Patricia did not respond, but Richard could see doubt in her eyes. The weapons she created had saved humanity, but also transformed it. The Black Fleet fought with cold efficiency bordering on ruthlessness. They gave no quarter, and took no prisoners unless absolutely necessary, and left nothing but ashes where Keltheran forces had been. The galaxy was taking notice, and in the Imperial Palace on Kelthera Prime, Emperor Thalos convened his war council. The ancient ruler, whose reign had spanned 400 years, listened to reports of defeat after defeat. With growing anger, Thalos demanded to know how a species barely a century into space travel defeated fleets that had conquered hundreds of worlds. His war council had no good answers because the truth was the Keltheran had grown complacent. 3,000 years of easy victories left them unprepared for an enemy that refused to follow standard patterns of resistance and surrender. One admiral reported that humans fought with technology violating known physical laws. Their ships ignored shields and armor, and every tactical advantage the Keltheran had was negated. Thalos said then they would change tactics because they could not meet humans in open battle, but they could make them pay for every world liberated. He ordered all remaining garrison forces to begin implementation of Protocol Omega. The room fell silent because Protocol Omega had never been used in the Empire's history. It was considered too brutal even for a civilization built on conquest because it required systematic execution of all civilian populations in occupied territories. One counselor spoke carefully that it was genocide, but Thalos corrected him a foe